At 31, I, Patricia, stood in the Greenwich Ballroom as my mother Eleanor accused me of theft to publicly destroy my name. 35 members of the elite watched while she screamed that I stole $500 to fund a squalid little life. The sharp, wet sound of her slap echoed against the mahogany paneling, the air smelling of lilies and vintage Bollinger. I didn't flinch or shed a single tear. I simply wiped her saliva off my cheek with a silk napkin. I looked into her eyes and whispered, "Worth the price." How that single blow ended up costing her everything she owned is what I'm here to tell. Growing up in the Vance estate meant living inside a meticulously calibrated machine where silence was the most valuable currency and appearance was the only law. My mother, Eleanor, was the self-appointed architect of this perfection. A woman who treated social standing like a military campaign and her children like high-stakes chess pieces. At the mahogany dinner table, the hierarchy was as rigid as the sterling silver cutlery from the 1920s. My father sat at the head, his eyes perpetually glazed over as he mentally audited the failing manufacturing plant in Bridgeport, while Eleanor directed the flow of conversation with the sharp precision of a symphony conductor. I learned early that my role was to be the negative space in the room, the necessary shadow that highlighted my brother's carefully curated brilliance. While he was lauded for mediocre marks at Exeter, my consistent straight A's were treated as a quiet, invisible expectation. I was the child who didn't fit the legacy. The invisibility wasn't a sudden event. It was a series of measured erasures that occurred over decades, documented in the cold edges of my memory. I vividly remember the annual family portrait in 2014, where the hired photographer spent 20 minutes adjusting the light on Eleanor's vintage pearls, but failed to notice I was partially obscured by a massive Ming vase. No one moved the porcelain. I remained a half-hidden face in a silver frame that sat on the Steinway piano for 5 years, a ghost in the family's official history. At 18, when I received my acceptance letter from the nation's top biotechnology program, Eleanor didn't even look up from her cream-colored invitation list for the upcoming Botanical Garden Gala. She simply asked if I had remembered to instruct the gardener about the wilting blue hydrangeas near the north gate. These weren't impulsive cruelties. In her logical world, she was merely maintaining the equilibrium of a legacy that had no room for me. However, there was one person who perceived the architecture of my isolation with terrifying clinical clarity. My grandmother, Helen, the true matriarch who held the family's remaining manufacturing shares with a grip of iron and velvet, lived in the quiet West Wing. She was surrounded by first-edition leather books and the persistent scent of jasmine and aged parchment. While Eleanor played her exhausting social games, Helen watched from the corners of the room, her eyes two sharp chips of flint that missed no subtle slight. She never openly defied Eleanor. Such a display would have been messy and uncharacteristic of her disciplined generation. Instead, she offered me the only currency that mattered in that sterile house: acknowledgement. One Tuesday afternoon, while I sat in the library after being excluded from a yacht club luncheon, she didn't offer comfort. She simply pointed to a specific passage in a Roman history text and whispered, "The most dangerous wolf is the one they forget to count." It was July 14th, 2014, a Tuesday that smelled of ozone and damp slate, as a summer storm hovered over the Sound. I stood in my father's study, a room dominated by the scent of expensive tobacco and the rhythmic ticking of a clock that felt like a countdown to my erasure. I was 19, clutching a letter from a prestigious laboratory in Zurich offering a summer fellowship, a bridge to the biotechnology career I had spent years planning. Today, I know that ticking was actually the sound of the Vance dynasty beginning its slow decay. Eleanor was there, seated in a velvet chair, turning a $25,000 vintage Cartier tank watch over in her manicured hands. She didn't look at the letter. She looked at the watch promised to me by Helen. In her cold voice, she informed me that the Vance image could not be compromised by a daughter pursuing a trade. My father remained silent as she explained my tuition had been redirected to settle my brother's debts. The air in the room became brittle as Eleanor stood up, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves against the silence. She didn't offer an apology. She offered a justification wrapped in the logic of family preservation, stating that a Vance must always prioritize the collective reputation over individual ambition. I watched her fingers slide the Cartier watch into her blazer, a deliberate theft of a legacy I hadn't yet realized was my only remaining tether to this house. "You are being emotional," she whispered, though my face was as still as the marble bust on the mantel. She told me I would be staying home to assist with the Centennial Gala, effectively turning my future into a footnote for her social calendar. What I didn't understand then, but what I feel with clinical clarity today, was that she was testing the structural integrity of my spirit, I noticed the faint smudge of lipstick on her glass and the way my father's hand finally stopped trembling. I realized then that no one would ever rescue me. I walked out of that study at 4:12 p.m. The sound of my flats on the parquet floor, the only evidence of my departure. I didn't pack the designer dresses or jewelry. I took only a backpack, my birth certificate, and $84 saved from selling old textbooks. The rain had started, a gray curtain that blurred the manicured lawn as I walked past the gate without looking back. I took the train to Grand Central, sitting in a car surrounded by the smell of wet wool and the hum of a city that didn't know I existed. I had no apartment, no tuition, and no family left, but as I watched the skyline emerge from the mist, a cold peace settled in my chest. The Patricia of today knows that this was the most valuable moment of my life. I made a silent vow that the next time I entered a room with Eleanor, I would not be seeking permission. I was starting from zero, but the math was finally mine to calculate. The transition from the marble halls of Greenwich to a fourth-floor walk-up in Long Island City was not a descent. It was a necessary recalibration of my reality. The air in that studio apartment smelled of industrial exhaust and the permanent metallic tang of the nearby N-train tracks, a sharp departure from the lavender-scented linens of my childhood. I worked 18-hour days, splitting my time between a commercial blood testing facility and a late-night diner where the grease seemed to seep into my very pores. My hands, once manicured for debutante balls, became stained with chemical reagents and scarred by the erratic heat of industrial dishwashers. I slept on a foam mattress that retained the chill of the uninsulated floor, tracking my progress not in social invitations, but in the slow accumulation of every cent that didn't go toward rent or ramen. Today, I can still recall the exact sound of the radiator's hiss at 3 a.m., a lonely, mechanical rhythm that kept me company while the rest of the world, including the family that had discarded me, slept in comfortable, unearned ignorance. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of the biotech firm where I eventually landed a junior researcher role, I was a ghost once again, though this time by choice. My colleagues saw a quiet, intensely focused woman who arrived before the janitors and left long after the security team had made their final rounds. They didn't know I was a Vance. I had dropped the surname on my applications, using only my middle name to erase the target on my back. I absorbed the condescension of senior partners who viewed me as a mere technician, a pair of hands to facilitate their more significant theories. While they spent their weekends at the Hamptons, I stayed in the lab, documenting the precise reactions of synthetic enzymes with a clinical obsession that bordered on the religious. I wasn't just working, I was building a fortress of data, a proprietary sequence that would eventually become the foundation of a pharmaceutical empire. I learned that in the world of high-stakes science, as in Greenwich, people only see what they expect to see, and they never expected a shadow to possess such a sharp gene-calculating mind. The turning point arrived not through luck, but through a calculated legacy that had been waiting for the right frequency to activate. In October 2018, a courier delivered a weathered envelope to the laboratory, addressed to the name I thought I had buried. Inside was a single key to a safe deposit box, and a notarized statement for a custodial account containing exactly $1,400, a sum Eleanor had dismissed as a rounding error in a dormant education fund. There was no card, only a small slip of parchment with my grandmother Helen's distinctive elegant script. The foundation is laid. Now, ensure the roof is made of steel. That money didn't buy me luxury. It bought the filing fees for my first 3 patents and the legal protection required to keep my discoveries out of the hands of predatory investors. Helen hadn't saved me with a fortune. She had handed me a scalpel and whispered where the skin was thinnest. I realized then that she had been watching my struggle from her wing in Greenwich, measuring my resolve with the same cold, analytical precision I was now applying to my work. By 2022, the company I founded, Aegis Biopharma, had moved from a shared incubator space to a glass-walled suite overlooking the East River, but the clinical coldness of my methodology remained unchanged. As we scaled, my focus shifted from the laboratory bench to the acquisition of distressed industrial debt, a strategic move that most of my board members found unnecessarily aggressive. They didn't understand that I was hunting specific ghosts. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a spreadsheet landed on my desk that listed the liabilities of a mid-sized manufacturing plant in Bridgeport and Connecticut. The name Vance Industrial Holdings was highlighted in red, indicating a default on a multi-million-dollar equipment lease. I sat in my ergonomic chair, the silence of the 48th floor a stark contrast to the memory of my father's trembling hands in his study years ago. I didn't feel joy or anger. I simply felt the satisfying click of a puzzle piece falling into its designated slot. While Eleanor was busy chairing the Botanical Garden Gala and worrying about the vintage of the champagne, I was quietly purchasing the very ground her prestige was built upon, one delinquent payment at a time. My life had become a series of high-definition observations, a sequence of events where I moved with the measured steps of a predator who had already won the race. My wardrobe consisted of bespoke charcoal suits and crisp white shirts that cost more than my first year's rent in Queens, yet I wore no jewelry, not even a simple watch. The absence of the Cartier tank was a physical void I felt every time I checked the digital clock on my monitors. I was now a woman who negotiated $50 million Series B funding rounds with the same emotional distance I used to order a cup of coffee. I watched the elite of Manhattan from across mahogany conference tables, recognizing the same scent of Bollinger and arrogance that had defined Eleanor's world. They saw a formidable executive, a woman of mysterious origins, who possessed a terrifying grasp of leverage and a refusal to engage in social pleasantries. I was no longer the invisible daughter hidden behind a Ming vase. I was the architect of a new reality, one where the Vance name was becoming synonymous with failure, while my own shadow grew long enough to cover their entire estate. The irony of the situation reached its zenith when the invitation for my grandmother Helen's 70th birthday gala arrived, printed on the same cream-colored cardstock Eleanor had used for decades. It sat on my desk next to the final foreclosure notice for the Bridgeport plant, a document I had authorized only 3 hours prior. The timing was almost poetic, a convergence of two timelines that had been drifting apart for 12 long years. I knew that Eleanor would be there, draped in her pearls and her manufactured perfection, entirely unaware that the woman she had once slapped for $500 now held the deed to her home. I spent 40 minutes staring at the invitation, noting the gold leaf border and the arrogant assumption that I would still crave their acceptance. Today, I understand that my return wasn't about seeking an apology or demanding a seat at their table. It was about the clinical execution of a truth that had been suppressed for too long. I picked up my pen and marked the accept box with a steady hand, the scratching of the nib on the expensive paper the only sound in the room. The trap was set, not by me, but by their own rotting legacy. The evening of June 22nd arrived with a heavy, atmospheric pressure that suggested a storm was brewing over the Long Island Sound, though the sky remained a deceptive, bruised purple. I stood in the grand foyer of the Greenwich estate, watching the 35 members of the Northeast elite filter into the ballroom, their movements as synchronized as a choreographed ballet of silk and arrogance. It was my grandmother Helen's 70th birthday gala, an event designed by Eleanor to be the ultimate display of Vance stability, despite the rotting foundations I knew were crumbling beneath the floorboards. I wore a charcoal bespoke suit that cost more than my father's remaining liquid assets, a sharp, sartorial contrast to the flowing gowns and vintage pearls surrounding me. I noticed the way the light from the 19th century chandeliers caught the dust motes in the air, a reminder that even in this house of forced perfection, decay was always present. I wasn't there for a reconciliation. I was there to witness the final performance of a dynasty that had forgotten how to breathe without a script. Eleanor was in her element, moving through the crowd with the predatory grace of a high-stakes fundraiser, her hand constantly adjusting the $25,000 vintage Cartier tank watch on her wrist. To any other observer, she was the epitome of philanthropic elegance, the tireless socialite holding the family together. But I saw the frantic tension in the way her fingers gripped her Hermes clutch. She knew the Bridgeport plant was in default, though she didn't yet realize the anonymous venture capital firm holding the debt was managed from my glass office in Manhattan. Every time our eyes met, she offered a thin, practiced smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes, treating me like an uninvited ghost who had wandered into her carefully curated dream. I remained a clinical observer of my own family, noting the specific vintage of the Bollinger being poured and the exact frequency of the string quartet's violins. The silence that had once been my cage had become my most sophisticated surveillance tool, allowing me to measure their desperation with terrifying precision. At exactly 9:14 p.m., the music stopped with a jarring, unrehearsed screech that sliced through the polite hum of conversation like a razor through silk. Eleanor stood near the mahogany podium, her face flushed with a manufactured distress that I immediately recognized as a calculated opening move. The 35 guests froze, their champagne glasses suspended in mid-air as they sensed the shift in the social equilibrium. Eleanor's voice, usually a melodic instrument of social control, was now sharp and trembling as she accused me of stealing $500 from her designer clutch earlier that evening. She claimed I was seeking funds for a squalid, troubled lifestyle, a phrase she enunciated with the clinical distance of a judge delivering a sentence. The absurdity of the accusation, that a woman who negotiated multi-million-dollar biotech mergers would steal $500, was lost on the room, as the collective weight of a decade of being the black sheep finally solidified into a public execution. I did not move a single muscle as Eleanor stepped toward me, her heels clicking on the parquet floor with the rhythmic finality of a firing squad. The air in the ballroom became thick and metallic, smelling of expensive lilies and the sharp ozone tang of impending violence. She reached me in 3 measured strides. Her Hermes clutch clutched against her chest like a shield of righteousness, while the elite of Greenwich watched in a silence so profound I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the foyer. Then came the slap, a sharp, wet sound that echoed off the mahogany paneling and left a burning, physical map of her resentment on my left cheek. I felt the edge of her Cartier ring graze my skin, a cold reminder of the legacy she thought she still controlled. I didn't flinch, nor did I lower my gaze. I simply stood there, absorbing the blow as if it were a data point in a long-term experiment. In the seconds following the slap, the ballroom remained a vacuum of sound, the 35 witnesses paralyzed by a breach of decorum that was both horrifying and deeply satisfying to their voyeuristic instincts. I could see my father in the periphery, his face a mask of gray exhaustion, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above my head to avoid the reality of his own cowardice. Eleanor was breathing heavily now, her mask of philanthropic grace finally slipping to reveal the raw, narcissistic panic underneath. She expected a reaction, tears, a denial, a desperate plea for her to believe me, but I offered her only the terrifying void of my silence. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a silk handkerchief, and slowly wiped a stray drop of her saliva from my cheek with the deliberate care of a scientist cleaning a microscope slide. Today, I know that my lack of response was the most violent thing I could have done to her in that moment. Across the room, near the shadows of the West Wing entrance, my grandmother Helen stood perfectly still, her eyes 2 sharp chips of flint reflecting the light of the chandeliers. We had spoken 3 weeks prior in the quiet of her library, where she had whispered the strategy that was now unfolding with mathematical certainty. Do not react when she comes for you. When the truth surfaces, your silence will be your greatest weapon. Looking at her now, I saw no pity, only a grim, ancestral satisfaction that I had finally learned the architecture of real power. Helen knew what Eleanor did not, that the house was already wired with discreet security cameras installed by my father after a string of local burglaries. The very surveillance meant to protect their physical property was currently documenting the exact moment Eleanor had planted that $500 in my coat, a digital ghost that would soon haunt her every waking hour. The sting on my cheek began to fade into a dull, rhythmic throb, but my mind remained unnervingly clear, documenting the specific angle of the light and the way the guests were already beginning to whisper behind their hands. I realized that this was the final episode of the life I had been forced to lead, the last time I would ever stand in this room as a victim of their collective delusions. I looked at Eleanor one last time, noting the way her hands were now shaking as she realized her performance hadn't yielded the emotional collapse she required to maintain her dominance. She had spent 19 years trying to erase my presence, but in slapping me, she had finally made me the most visible person in the room. I felt a cold, crystalline peace settle over me, a realization that the $500 lie was the most expensive mistake she would ever make in a lifetime of calculated risks. I turned away from her without saying a single word, my movement fluid and devoid of the frantic energy of the wounded. I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing with a steady, measured tempo that commanded the attention of everyone in the ballroom. I didn't look at my father, whose silence had been his own form of violence for over a decade, nor did I seek out the judgmental eyes of the socialites who had spent years excluding me from their tables. The sound of my heels on the parquet was the only noise in the room, a rhythmic declaration that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. I felt the weight of the house on my shoulders, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a property I was preparing to foreclose upon. The exit wasn't a retreat. It was the clinical conclusion of a research phase that had lasted 12 long, exhausting years. As I reached the grand foyer, I passed the Ming vase that had once partially obscured me in the family portrait, and for the first time in my life, I felt taller than the porcelain. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the humid Greenwich night just as the first few drops of rain began to fall, cool and precise against my skin. I didn't look back at the illuminated windows of the estate or the silhouette of my mother standing frozen in the ballroom. I walked toward my car, a black sedan waiting at the end of the driveway like a shadow, knowing that the documentation of this night was already being uploaded to a server Eleanor couldn't touch. The silence of the night was a relief after the suffocating noise of their hypocrisy, a clean slate upon which I was about to write the final chapter of the Vance legacy. Tonight, as I sit in my Manhattan office and look at the $25,000 Cartier watch that now sits permanently on my desk, I can still feel the ghost of that slap, but it no longer carries the weight of shame. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous wolf is indeed the one they forget to count, and that justice, when it arrives, doesn't need to scream to be heard. Eleanor thought she was burying me in that ballroom, but she was actually digging the foundation for her own exile. The truth of what the cameras saw that night would soon move through the elite circles of New York like a terminal virus, dismantling her reputation, her marriage, and her social standing with a cold, relentless efficiency. What happened in the weeks following that gala changed everything I thought I knew about the price of a lie, and the next time I saw Eleanor, she was the one who was invisible. The conference room in the West Wing smelled of lemon-scented beeswax and the cold, metallic tang of the early October air. At exactly 10:03 a.m., the light from the tall Georgian windows hit the silver water pitcher with a clinical sharpness that made my eyes ache. My father sat at the far end of the table, his skin the color of damp parchment, clutching a tablet as if it were a life raft in a rising tide. Eleanor was there too, wearing a cream-colored Chanel suit that screamed of a stability she no longer possessed, her fingers obsessively adjusting the $25,000 Cartier watch on her wrist. Around us sat 3 legal representatives and my grandmother Helen, who remained as still as a marble statue in the corner of the room. The silence was not the respectful kind found in libraries. It was the suffocating, pre-storm pressure of a reality about to be rewritten by a single digital file. I sat opposite Eleanor, my hands folded on a navy blue folder, observing the frantic pulse in her neck. The screen of the tablet flickered to life, projecting a grainy 4K resolution onto the white wall behind my father's head. The timestamp read 11:22 p.m. on the night of the gala, a time when the ballroom below was still vibrating with the sounds of the string quartet. The camera, one of 4 discreetly installed after the June burglaries, showed the interior of the coat closet with terrifying high-definition clarity. We watched in a silence that felt like a physical weight as Eleanor's silhouette appeared on the screen, her movements fluid and practiced. She didn't look like a mother. She looked like a technician performing a necessary, albeit dirty, task. With the precision of a jeweler, she reached into her Hermes clutch, pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills, and slid them into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer. The digital ghost of her betrayal moved with a cold efficiency that left no room for interpretation, or the flowery justifications she had spent a lifetime perfecting for the Greenwich elite. Eleanor didn't scream or offer a theatrical denial. Instead, she let out a short, sharp exhale that sounded like a punctured tire. Her internal logic, the one that convinced her she was protecting the family's old money reputation by neutralizing the daughter she couldn't control, was visible in the frantic darting of her eyes. She looked at my father, perhaps expecting the usual glazed-over compliance he had offered for 30 years, but he refused to meet her gaze, his focus fixed on the divorce papers already resting in his briefcase. The 35 socialites who had witnessed the slap were already receiving the truncated version of this footage via encrypted links, a social virus that would ensure she was never invited to another board meeting in Manhattan. She reached for her water glass, her hand trembling so violently that the ice cubes rattled against the crystal with a rhythmic, frantic sound. I noted the precise angle of her wrist and the way her foundation was beginning to crack. I opened my navy blue folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany surface, the movement as measured and quiet as a prayer. The document detailed the acquisition of Vance Industrial Holdings' outstanding $14.2 million equipment lease, a debt that had been quietly transferred to Aegis Biopharma 3 weeks prior to the gala. The realization hit Eleanor with the force of a physical blow, more devastating than any slap she had ever delivered in her life. She had spent a decade treating me as a squalid footnote, unaware that I was the anonymous creditor who now held the keys to her estate and the very ground her prestige was built upon. The manufacturing plant in Bridgeport, the legacy my father had failed to protect, was now a subsidiary of the empire I had built in the shadows of Long Island City. There was no anger in my voice when I informed her that the foreclosure process was already underway. Only the clinical delivery of a financial fact. "You were my daughter," Eleanor whispered, her voice a fragile, brittle thing that finally matched the decaying state of the room. She tried to frame her sabotage as a desperate act of motherhood. a narrative where she was the martyr and I was the chaos she had to contain for the sake of the collective. I didn't interrupt her. I simply waited for the silence to return, noting the way the sunlight had shifted to highlight the dust on the portrait of my grandfather behind her. When she finally stopped, I leaned forward slightly, the fabric of my bespoke suit rustling with a sharp, expensive sound. A mother protects her children. A socialite protects her image, I said, my voice as cold and level as a frozen lake in midwinter. You chose the image, Eleanor, and now you have neither. I didn't need to yell to be heard. The weight of the $14.2 million debt and the digital evidence of her lie spoke with a volume she could never match. My father reached across the table and unclasped the $25,000 vintage Cartier tank watch from Eleanor's wrist, his movement slow and devoid of the affection that had once defined their marriage. The metal was warm from her skin, a physical remnant of a life she was now being formally evicted from. He handed it to me without a word, his eyes finally meeting mine with a mixture of shame and a newfound, terrifying respect. I held the watch in my palm, feeling its specific weight and the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the movement Helen had promised me when I was 19. This wasn't a victory. It was a restoration of the structural integrity of my history, a moment where the stolen time was finally returned to its rightful owner. Eleanor watched the transfer with a hollow expression, realizing that her currency had been devalued to zero in a single morning. The social exile she feared most had already begun, documented in the cold, unyielding lines of the legal documents. I stood up at exactly 10:42 a.m., smoothing the front of my jacket and sliding the Cartier watch into my pocket, the metal a comforting, solid weight against my thigh. The meeting was over, not because we had finished the discussion, but because there was nothing left for the Vances to say. I walked toward the door, my footsteps on the parquet floor a steady, confident rhythm that echoed through the West Wing with the finality of a closing coffin. I didn't look back at Eleanor, who remained frozen in her velvet chair, a ghost in her own house who had finally become as invisible as she had once tried to make me. As I stepped out into the crisp Connecticut air, I felt the first few drops of a cold, precise rain against my face, a cleansing contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the estate. The car was waiting at the end of the gravel drive, and as I pulled away, I noted the way the Vance name on the gate looked smaller. The silence of the Greenwich estate in the weeks following the gala was a heavy, physical substance, different from the curated peace Eleanor had spent decades maintaining. I watched from my Manhattan office as the social calendar she once dominated began to shed her name like a dying tree loses its leaves. The first to go was the Metropolitan Opera Guild's autumn luncheon, followed swiftly by the board of the Botanical Garden, where her seat was filled by a younger, less radioactive philanthropist from Chicago. I received the digital notifications of these removals with a clinical detachment, noting the exact time each press release was issued. It wasn't about spite. It was about the natural decomposition of a reputation built on the fragile foundation of a lie. Eleanor remained in the West Wing, a ghost in a house that was technically no longer hers, surrounded by silk wallpaper that seemed to absorb her increasingly frantic phone calls. The world she valued most was erasing her in real time. By the third week of October, the financial reality of the Vance Industrial Holdings default had become a matter of public record, a dry series of filings in the Bridgeport courthouse. My father's legal team moved with the cold, surgical precision I had requested, ensuring that every asset was scrutinized under the harsh light of the divorce process. Eleanor's personal accounts, once a bottomless well of discretionary spending, were frozen pending the resolution of the divorce and the massive equipment lease liabilities I now controlled. I reviewed the spreadsheets every Tuesday at 4 p.m., noting the $14.2 million figure that sat like a tombstone over her social ambitions. She tried to reach me through a series of intermediaries, distanced cousins and former friends, who were suddenly very concerned about family unity, but I ignored every call that didn't come from a registered process server. My silence was not a weapon. It was a boundary she had no currency left to cross, a mathematical certainty she couldn't argue with. My brother, Julian, was the first to attempt a personal reconciliation, arriving at my office on a Thursday morning without an appointment, smelling of expensive gin and desperation. He sat in the ergonomic chair across from my desk, his hands fidgeting with a gold lighter that had been a gift from our father 3 Christmases ago. He spoke of misunderstandings and the unfortunate stress Eleanor had been under, trying to frame her sabotage as a temporary lapse in judgment rather than a lifelong strategy. I watched the way the sunlight from the floor-to-ceiling windows highlighted the sweat on his upper lip, a detail I recorded with the same precision I used for my biotech patents. I told him that my terms for any future interaction were non-negotiable. A full notarized admission of the 2014 tuition theft and the immediate return of the family's remaining Bridgeport shares. He didn't stay long after that. The cost of honesty was apparently higher than the loyalty he claimed to feel for our mother. The divorce proceedings were finalized on a Tuesday morning in November, a gray day where the rain turned the Hudson River into a churning mass of slate and silver. My father walked out of the courtroom a free man, though his eyes carried the hollow expression of someone who had realized 30 years too late that he had been an accomplice to his own erasure. He moved into a small, well-appointed apartment in the West Village, a space that smelled of new leather and the absence of Eleanor's pervasive lavender perfume. He sent me a short mom-typed letter 2 days later, apologizing for the 2014 study meeting and the decade of silence that followed. But I didn't reply with words of forgiveness. Instead, I sent him the deed to a small vineyard in Napa he had always dreamed of owning, a gesture of closure rather than a bridge to a new relationship. We were both survivors of the same shipwreck, but we were rowing in entirely different directions now. Grandma Helen remained the only constant in the shifting architecture of the Vance family, her presence in the West Wing a silent anchor in a sea of rising litigation. I visited her every other Sunday, sitting in the library surrounded by the scent of jasmine and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock that Eleanor had never been able to silence. We didn't discuss the gala or the $500 lie. Such things were beneath the dignity of the strategy we had executed with such cold, ancestral precision. She poured the tea with a steady hand, her eyes two sharp chips of flint that seemed to see through the very walls of the estate she had helped build. She was the one who reminded me that power is not found in the noise of a victory, but in the quiet capacity to endure until the opposition destroys itself. I left her each time with a sense of clarity that no board meeting could ever provide, a confirmation that I was finally the wolf she had raised. Eleanor's social exile reached its zenith during the annual Winter Solstice Ball, an event she had chaired for 15 years with the iron-fisted grace of a high society monarch. This year, her name was not only absent from the committee list, but was actively avoided in the hushed conversations of the attendees who sipped vintage Krug in the grand ballroom. I attended as a guest of a major pharmaceutical donor, wearing a midnight blue velvet gown that felt like a second skin and the $25,000 Cartier tank watch on my left wrist. I saw her former inner circle huddled near the buffet, their eyes darting away whenever I glanced in their direction, a physical manifestation of the social contagion she had become. They weren't mourning her absence. They were terrified of being associated with her failure. I spent the evening discussing enzyme kinetics and market volatility, a woman of substance in a room full of expensive shadows, realizing that the prestige she had died for was nothing more than a well-dressed void. By January, the foreclosure on the Greenwich estate was moving through its final legal stages, a process that felt as inevitable as the changing of the tides. I reviewed the appraisal reports with a clinical eye, noting the $18.5 million valuation and the specific repairs needed for the North Wing's crumbling masonry. Eleanor was given 30 days to vacate the premises, a deadline that arrived with a brutal, freezing wind that rattled the windows of the grand foyer. She sent a final, 12-page handwritten letter filled with accusations of unfilial cruelty and a calculated vengeance, trying one last time to cast herself as the victim of a monstrous daughter. I didn't read past the first page. The ink was smudged with what I assumed were tears, but they were the tears of a strategist who had lost her map, not a mother who had lost her child. I filed the letter in a folder labeled Correspondence Terminated and authorized the movers to begin their work on the 1st of the month. The day Eleanor moved out of the estate, I was in Zurich attending a biotechnology symposium, surrounded by the sharp, sterile air of the Swiss Alps and the hum of scientific progress. I received a text from the security firm at 2:14 p.m., confirming that the last of her trunks had been loaded into a nondescript rental van, and she had departed for a small rental in a less fashionable part of New Jersey. There was no grand exit, no final confrontation on the steps of the mansion she had treated like a fortress of her own making. She left in a silence that was a direct echo of the silence she had imposed on me for 19 years, a symmetry that I noted with a grim, mathematical satisfaction. The $500 lie had cost her the 1920s silver, the Hermès collection, and the very air she breathed as a socialite, leaving her with nothing but the memory of a slap that had missed its target. I turned my attention back to the presentation on synthetic proteins, the future far more interesting than her past. The restructuring of Vance Industrial Holdings into a subsidiary of Aegis Biopharma was completed in late February, a transition that saved 300 jobs in Bridgeport, but erased the Vance name from the signage. I walked through the factory floor on a Tuesday morning, the air smelling of hot oil and the rhythmic thrum of industrial presses, a sound that my father had always associated with failure, but I saw as the heartbeat of a new efficiency. The employees didn't know I was the daughter who had been discarded. They saw a CEO who understood the precise value of their labor and the structural integrity of their output. I had replaced the mahogany desks in the executive suite with glass and steel, a visual representation of the transparency that would now define the company's operations. I sat in my father's former office, looking at the $14.2 million debt resolution papers, and felt a profound sense of equilibrium. I wasn't just owning their debt. I was rewriting the very definition of what it meant to be a Vance. As the months passed, the calls for family dinners and healing sessions from distant relatives began to fade, replaced by a cold, mutual understanding that the old hierarchy was dead. I had established a foundation in Helen's name to fund scholarships for young women in STEM, a $5 million endowment that did more for the family's legacy than 40 years of Eleanor's charity balls ever could. When my Aunt Margaret attempted to guilt me into paying for Julian's third stint in rehab, I sent her a copy of the 2014 bank statements, showing the redirected tuition funds, and a polite note stating that my involvement in family finances was strictly limited to legal obligations. I was no longer the black sheep to be managed or the invisible daughter to be ignored. I was the primary creditor of their existence, a role I performed with a clinical, unwavering discipline. They learned that my generosity was a matter of policy, not emotion, and that every favor came with a set of conditions that favored the truth. In the spring of 2026, the Greenwich estate was reopened not as a private residence, but as the Helen Vance Institute for Biotechnology, a research facility that smelled of ozone and possibility. I stood on the manicured lawn during the opening ceremony, the $25,000 Cartier watch catching the April sun as I shook hands with the state's leading scientific minds. There were no Ming vases to hide behind, and no Eleanor to orchestrate the light. The house was finally illuminated by the clarity of its new purpose. I noticed my father standing near the back, looking older but peaceful, watching the transformation of his failure into my success with a quiet or respectful distance. He didn't try to claim a seat on the board, and I didn't offer him one. We had reached a plateau of mutual acknowledgement that required no further words. The 2014 study meeting felt like it had happened in another century, a historical artifact of a war that had finally reached its clinical conclusion. Eleanor's final attempt at a social comeback occurred during a minor charity gala in Newark, an event so far below her previous standards that it was almost a caricature of her former life. She was photographed wearing a dress from 3 seasons ago, her face a mask of desperate, forced cheer that the local society columnist described as brave, but the Greenwich elite saw as tragic. I saw the photo while waiting for a flight at JFK, noting the way she still wore her pearls as if they were a suit of armor against the reality of her $2,400 a month apartment. She had become the very thing she once mocked, a woman of mysterious origins and diminished prospects, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had moved on without her. I felt no satisfaction in her decline, only the cold, analytical observation that she had finally achieved the invisibility she had once tried to impose on me. I closed the magazine and boarded my flight to London, my schedule too full of the future to accommodate her past. My relationship with the concept of family had undergone a total structural overhaul, moving from a source of trauma to a series of data points in a broader life strategy. I realized that the $500 lie was never really about the money. It was the final stress test of a system that was designed to fail those who dared to be more than a reflection of Eleanor's ego. By surviving it, I had gained a level of psychological leverage that few people ever possess, a clinical understanding of how to build a life on the ruins of a betrayal. I spent my weekends at a quiet house in Sag Harbor that smelled of salt air and old books, far away from the suffocating expectations of the Northeast elite. I was a woman who had been slapped in a ballroom and walked out as the owner of the house, a transformation that required no apologies and no regrets. I lived with a precision that was both my armor and my greatest achievement, a survivor who had learned to breathe in the cold. The letters from my brother Julian eventually stopped, replaced by a monthly automated transfer from the trust Helen had set up for him, a sum that kept him in a comfortable, albeit unremarkable, life in Vermont. He had learned that I was not a source of infinite bailouts, but a woman who measured the value of an investment by its return on character. Our father occasionally sent me photos of the vineyard in Napa, showing the growth of the vines and the specific clarity of the California light, a quiet communication that I acknowledged with a brief, professional reply. We were a family of fragments, held together by the gravity of a shared history, but no longer bound by the toxic scripts of our youth. The Vance legacy had been dismantled and rebuilt into something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more honest. I wore the Cartier watch every day, not as a status symbol, but as a clinical reminder of the 19-year-old girl who had walked out into the rain with $84. By the one-year anniversary of the gala, the story of the $500 lie had become a cautionary tale whispered in the drawing rooms of Greenwich and the boardrooms of Manhattan. It was the story of the woman who didn't cry, the mother who couldn't stop lying, and the grandmother who played the long game with the patience of a master chess player. I was often asked for my side of the story by ambitious journalists, but I never granted an interview. The documents I had filed in court were the only testimony I ever needed. The truth didn't need a publicist to be devastating. It only needed the persistence of time and the cold, unyielding nature of a digital recording. I remained a woman of few words and significant actions, a CEO who understood that the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of noise is to remain perfectly, terrifyingly still. I had moved beyond the need for validation from a society that had watched me be slapped and said nothing. Looking back from the vantage point of my 40th birthday, I can see the architecture of my life with a high-definition clarity that was impossible during the years of my isolation. The events of 2014 and the gala of 2026 were not tragedies. They were the necessary fires that tempered the steel of my current existence. I sit in my office overlooking the East River, the hum of the city a distant, mechanical rhythm that matches the steady ticking of the Cartier watch on my wrist. I am a woman who built an empire on the ruins of a reputation, a survivor who turned the silence of her family into the strength of her corporation. Eleanor is a distant memory, a cautionary footnote in a history that I have rewritten in my own hand, using the clinical precision I learned in the shadows of her house. I have no anger left for her, only a profound, analytical appreciation for the way her cruelty forced me to become the woman I am today. The $14.2 million debt that once sat like a death sentence over the Vance manufacturing plant has long since been paid off, replaced by a series of high-yield dividends that fund the research at the Helen Vance Institute. I am the sole trustee of the family's remaining assets, a responsibility I handle with the same emotional distance I use for my quarterly tax filings. My father passed away peacefully last spring in his vineyard, leaving behind a letter that finally named the 2014 tuition theft as the moment his own life had ended and mine had truly begun. I didn't cry at the funeral. I simply noted the precise way the sun hit the marble of his headstone and the respectful silence of the few friends who had remained loyal to him. He was a man who had lived in the shadow of a lie for too long, and his death was a final, quiet release from the scripts he never had the courage to rewrite. Julian remains in Vermont, a man of quiet habits and modest ambitions who occasionally sends me a bottle of the maple syrup he produces on his small farm. We have reached a state of peaceful coexistence, a relationship built on the recognition of our shared trauma and the different ways we chose to survive it. He is no longer the favorite son, and I am no longer the invisible daughter. We are simply two people who share a surname and a history of silence. He understands that my terms for any future involvement in his life are based on the same clinical honesty I demand from my researchers, a boundary that he respects with a newfound, sober discipline. The Vance family, once a machine of social dominance, is now a collection of individuals living quiet, honest lives on the edges of the world we once tried to conquer. We have traded the prestige of the lie for the peace of the truth. Grandma Helen passed away at 96, leaving behind a library that smelled of jasmine and a legacy of quiet, strategic resistance that I continue to honor in every decision I make. She died as she lived, with a steady hand and a mind that was as sharp as a scalpel until the very last breath. Her final words to me a simple, whispered, "The wolf has finished the count." I inherited her collection of Roman history texts and the specific, clinical way she looked at a room full of people. A gift of observation that has served me better than any degree. I sat in her library for 3 hours after the service, listening to the ticking of the clock and feeling the weight of the responsibility she had handed me when I was 19. She was the one who saw the architecture of the slap before Eleanor ever raised her hand, and she was the one who taught me that the most powerful weapon in any war is a silence that is backed by evidence. My company, Aegis Biopharma, is now the leading producer of synthetic enzymes in the world, a $20 billion entity that operates with a level of transparency that is considered radical in the pharmaceutical industry. I have built a corporate culture on the ruins of the Vance family's secrecy, a place where data is the only currency and character is the only prerequisite for advancement. My employees know that I value the truth above all else, and that a single lie is a terminal offense in my organization. a policy that has protected us from the volatility of the market. I am a woman who leads with a cold, analytical precision, a CEO who understands that the structural integrity of a company is only as strong as the integrity of its leadership. I have no interest in the social games of Manhattan. I am too busy building a future where the math of existence is no longer a tool for sabotage. I occasionally receive a formal request from Eleanor's legal team for a cost of living adjustment to her monthly stipend, a document I review with a clinical detachment before authorizing the same modest amount every year. She lives in a small apartment in a town where no one knows her former name, a reality that I record as a data point in the ongoing study of her decline. She no longer sends letters of accusation. She sends short, polite notes requesting consideration for her medical expenses, a shift in tone that I note with a grim, mathematical satisfaction. She has learned the value of the $500 she once planted in my coat, a lesson that cost her everything she once valued. I am the woman who signs her checks, a final, ironic symmetry that brings a sense of clinical closure to our 19-year conflict. We have both found our places in the new hierarchy, and mine is at the top of the ledger. The $25,000 Cartier watch sits on my wrist every morning as I prepare for the day, its weight a physical reminder of the time that was stolen and the dignity that was reclaimed. It is no longer a symbol of the Vance family's prestige, but a testament to the girl who survived the silence of their house and built an empire on her own terms. I look at the face of the watch and see the reflection of a woman who is no longer defined by the trauma of her past, but by the clinical clarity of her present. I have walked through the fire and come out the other side as something far more dangerous than a victim. I am a survivor with a photographic memory and a folder full of evidence. The silence that once suffocated me is now my most powerful tool, a space where I can observe the world with the distance of a scientist and the precision of a strategist. My home in Sag Harbor is a fortress of peace, a space where the air is clean and the only sound is the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shore. I spend my evenings reading the texts Helen left me, documenting the rise and fall of empires with the same analytical focus I once used to study Eleanor's social campaigns. I am a woman who has found the equilibrium I was once denied, a balance of power and peace that requires no further validation from the ghosts of Greenwich. I have no need for the approval of a society that values appearance over substance, a realization that has freed me to pursue the truth with a relentless, uncompromising discipline. I am Patricia Vance, and the story of my life is no longer a tragedy written by my mother, but a clinical success story written by my own hand, one data point at a time. The world continues to turn, and the elite of the Northeast continue to host their gala balls and charity luncheons, unaware that the rules of their game have been permanently rewritten by my existence. I watch them from a distance, noting the same patterns of arrogance and the same scent of Bollinger that defined the world I walked out of in 2026. They are the shadows in a history that I have outgrown, a collection of expensive artifacts in a museum of a dying era. I am the future they never saw coming, a woman of substance who built a fortune on the ruins of their hypocrisy, and a legacy on the foundations of a $500 lie. The truth is a cold, precise thing, and I am its primary witness, documenting the decay of their world with the same clinical accuracy I use to measure the reactions of my enzymes. I am the wolf they forgot to count, and I have finished the race. In the quiet moments of the early morning, I often think about the girl who stood in that ballroom in Greenwich, absorbing a slap from a mother who had already erased her future. I see her clearly, a high-definition image of resilience and silence, and I feel a profound, clinical respect for her ability to wait for the truth to surface. She was the one who knew that a single document could dismantle a dynasty, and she was the one who had the courage to walk out into the rain without looking back. I am her future, the physical realization of the vows she made in that Grand Central train car, a woman who has turned a $500 lie into a $20 billion reality. We are the same person, separated only by time and the accumulation of every cent that didn't go toward the lie. We have won the war, and the victory is silent. The Helen Vance Institute continues to produce breakthroughs in biotechnology that are changing the lives of millions, a legacy of healing that stands in stark contrast to the legacy of sabotage Eleanor tried to build. I walk through the laboratories and see the faces of the young women who are pursuing the trades that were once denied to me, their futures bright with the clarity of their own ambitions. I am not their mother, but I am their architect, providing the foundation and the steel they need to build their own fortresses of truth. The house in Greenwich is no longer a place of silence and shame. It is a place of noise and discovery, a living monument to the woman who coached me to wait for the truth. I have fulfilled the promise I made to Helen in her library. And the result is a world that is a little more honest and a lot more capable. As I prepare to finalize the last of the Vance estate's legal proceedings, I feel a sense of clinical finality that is more satisfying than any emotional catharsis could ever be. The $18.5 million valuation of the house, the $14.2 million debt resolution, and the $500 lie are all recorded in the same ledger, a mathematical proof of the price of a betrayal. I am closing the book on a chapter of history that lasted 19 long, exhausting years, a story that has finally reached its logical and inevitable conclusion. I have no more questions for Eleanor, and no more conditions for Julian. I have only the steady, rhythmic ticking of the Cartier watch to keep me company. The past is a series of data points that I have analyzed and filed away, leaving me with a clean slate and a future that is entirely mine to calculate. I am a woman who has found her voice in the silence. The rain against the window of my office is cool and precise, a reminder of the night I walked out of the estate and into the unknown. I am no longer afraid of the storm or the silence. I have learned to breathe in the atmosphere of the cold and to find my direction in the mist. I am a woman of high-stakes science and low-profile existence, a CEO who understands that the most valuable currency in any world is the truth. I have built a life that is as solid and as unyielding as the steel in my factory, a fortress of integrity that no amount of social sabotage can ever hope to penetrate. I am the architect of my own reality, a survivor who has turned a slap into a legacy and a lie into a fortune. The world is full of ghosts, but I am a woman of substance, and I am finally, completely free. In the final audit of the Vance family's history, the $500 lie will be recorded as the catalyst for a transformation that no one saw coming, a moment where the invisible daughter finally became the most powerful person in the room. I have reviewed the footage of the slap 1,000 times, not out of a need for revenge, but to study the exact moment my mother's empire began to turn into ash. I see the light on her Cartier watch, the pulse in her neck, and the terrifying void in her eyes, and I realize that she was always more afraid of me than I was of her. She knew that my silence was a countdown to her own exposure, a digital ghost that would eventually dismantle everything she held dear. I am the woman who waited for the truth, and in the end, the truth was the only thing that mattered. As the sun sets over the East River, I check the time on my $25,000 Cartier watch and prepare for the final meeting of the day, a strategy session for the next phase of Aegis Biopharma's expansion. I move with a measured, confident grace, a woman who understands the precise value of her time and the structural integrity of her soul. I have survived the Greenwich Ballroom and the Long Island City walk-up, the $14.2 million debt and the $500 lie, and I have come out the other side with a clinical, unwavering clarity. I am the wolf who finished the count, the daughter who owned the debt, and the woman who finally reclaimed her dignity. The future is a series of possibilities that I am ready to calculate, a new world where the silence is no longer a cage, but a platform for the truth. The final document is signed, the last ledger is closed, and the Vance legacy is officially a matter of historical record, a story of prestige, betrayal, and a clinical recovery. I walk out of my office and into the cool Manhattan night, my footsteps on the pavement a steady, rhythmic declaration of my own existence. I don't look back at the glass towers or the shadows of my past. I walk toward the future with a steady hand and a mind that is as sharp as a scalpel. I am Patricia Vance, and the most dangerous wolf is indeed the one they forget to count. A truth that I have proven with every data point of my life. The $500 lie is over, and the real work has only just begun. A legacy of truth that will outlast any socialite's ball. I am finally, and forever, the architect of my own destiny, moving forward with the precise weight of the Cartier watch on my wrist. I sit on the terrace of my Sag Harbor home at exactly 6:14 a.m., watching the fog lift off the Atlantic with a clinical precision requiring no effort. There is no scent of Bollinger here, only the sharp, clean brine of the ocean and the faint aroma of the black coffee I prepared myself in a kitchen containing no mahogany and no ghosts. The silence is absolute, a structural component of a life I built without seeking permission or validation from the shadows of Greenwich. I check the $25,000 Cartier watch on my wrist, noting the rhythmic sweep of the second hand, a movement that no longer feels like a countdown to an ambush. I am 35, and for the first time in my existence, the air I breathe belongs entirely to me, purchased at the cost of a dynasty that chose an image over a daughter. The sunlight hits the water at 32 degrees, a data point in a morning defined by its lack of drama. On the teak table beside me sits a single, weathered envelope containing the final dissolution papers of the Vance Trust, a document I have already authorized to be archived with my first pharmaceutical patents. I do not feel the need to burn it or celebrate. I simply note its presence with the same emotional distance I would apply to a laboratory report on enzyme kinetics. Across the lawn, the Institute's lights flicker on, a reminder that the estate I once feared is now a center of empirical truth, managed by people who value evidence over pedigree. I reach for my tablet to review the overnight clinical trials, my fingers steady and devoid of the tremors that once plagued my mother's hands during her final, desperate galas. The Cartier watch catches the light, a silent witness to the fact that time, once stolen, can be reclaimed through the relentless application of discipline and silence. I am a woman who has converted every slap into a brick for her own fortress. To those of you who have ever stood in a room full of people, paid to ignore your pain, I have no advice, only a clinical observation born from 12 years of strategic isolation. You already know that justice does not arrive with the fanfare of an apology or the warmth of a reconciliation. It arrives as a quiet, mathematical correction of a long-standing error. It is found in the moment you realize the power they held over you was merely a social construct, a script you were forced to read until you decided to rewrite the ending. The architecture of a lie is always fragile, requiring a constant infusion of new deceptions to maintain its integrity, while the truth requires nothing but the patience to wait for the storm to pass. My mother thought she was burying me, but she was merely digging the foundation for my independence, a fact she now contemplates in a small apartment far from Greenwich's lights. Survival is calculation. I look at the horizon where the gray sea meets the blue sky, a boundary as sharp and unyielding as the one I have drawn around my life. I am no longer the black sheep or invisible daughter. I am the primary creditor of a history that tried to foreclose on my soul and failed with catastrophic results. The $500 lie was Eleanor's most expensive mistake, and the Cartier watch is the only receipt I needed to prove my dignity was never for sale. As I prepare to enter the laboratory, I am struck by the profound, clinical peace that comes from knowing exactly who I am and what I have endured. The silence of the morning is a relief, a clean slate upon which I have written a success story requiring no footnotes or apologies. If you have ever been the one they forgot to count, only to return as the one who owns the ledger, when was the moment you realized you won?